continent. Ireland was the first to publish, but certainly not the last. So when we talk about organizations changing into 4-day weeks, we highly encourage leaders to be part of that transition.
Lots of my clients come to me, and this is one of the requests, like, geez, I'd love to do a 4-day week, either for more personal time, start another business or a side hustle and so on. Hi, my name is Ronan Kennedy, and I'm a career coach and podcast host. I'm interviewing people from various different careers, industries and backgrounds to find out what they do, how they got into it, and what they like or dislike about their roles. So whether you're a seasoned professional looking for some inspiration, or whether you're a new grad looking for some ideas and options, this podcast has something for you. So join us every week as we delve into the world of work, share personal and professional development tips, and uncover the secrets to a fulfilling career. Okay, so today I'm joined with Dr. Dale Whelehan. Dr. Dale, thanks so much for joining today. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Especially considering your time is very precious doing a 4-day work week, right?
Absolutely, yeah. You've left the cat among the pigeons. I'm the CEO of an organization called Workweek Global.
Yeah, fantastic. So I've tons of questions I want to ask you on that. But just before we get into that, could you tell us a little bit about your career history so far?
Yeah, I have a bit of a colourful career path, to be honest. I originally trained as a physiotherapist in Ireland, and I was always interested in the health and well-being of people, but I wasn't a very good physio, and it wasn't something that hugely motivated me. But I was always really interested in the psychological aspects and the social aspects of working with people. And so one of the hardest things, I suppose, with healthcare careers is that you often are quite pigeonholed into that career. So in order to take a step back, actually, I went on and did a PhD in behavior science and became a behavioral scientist after that. I explored the relationship between sleep deprivation and fatigue on performance in surgeons. And it was in the middle of my PhD that the COVID pandemic hit us all, and the concept of burnout and fatigue became something that we're all now acutely, familiar with. And I climbed down my ivory tower of academia after that, and I climbed up my ivory tower in consulting with the Big Four, and did that for less than 2 years, but specialized in setting up their culture and behavior change offering there. But always wanted to be able to get back to using my skills to improve health and well-being of people. And so the conversation about 4-day week had been, kind of bubbling over the last few years, and an opportunity came to lead this organization called 4-day Week Global, which is a not-for-profit that runs trials across the world evaluating the effectiveness of time reduction on a myriad of different outcomes for people and business and society. And so I took that opportunity, and it's been quite the journey.
That's fantastic. So you've been working with 4-day week for 4 years?
Yeah, so I was originally involved in the Irish campaign, which was the first cohort of businesses to actually implement a 4-day week. And that was, dating back now to 2020, early 2019, when they were starting having that conversation. But since then, 4-day Week Global has actually been running trials across the world in every continent. So
Okay, amazing.
Ireland was the first to publish, but certainly not the last.
Yeah, amazing. Lots of my clients come to me, and this is one of the requests, like, geez, I'd love to do a 4-day week, either for more personal time, start another business or a side hustle and so on. But can I ask you, how did you get into CEO position so quickly?
I asked for it.
Okay. Ask and you shall receive.
Honestly, I wish there was a more complex way of saying it, but I definitely realized you have to be in it to win it. And I always knew that I wanted to be able to get into a career where I could bridge my interest in research into practice. And those opportunities don't come on LinkedIn jobs, or through those sort of spaces as much as you might hope they would. So I became quite aware of the hidden job market, and I knew that there was a vacancy in place. They weren't actively recruiting for it, but I reached out to the founder, and it led to about 2 months worth of conversations, and ultimately stepping in.
Super. But you were part of the committee first for a few years, right? So it seems like you had a good strategy, right? You were going to contribute first. And also I wonder, I was on your LinkedIn, you've over 15,000 followers. So Do you think the visibility that you create in your career helps you with these type of opportunities?
Yeah, actually, I think one of the main reasons I probably came to the forefront was that I went viral when the Irish results were published on Twitter. So I had, I think, 40,000 likes or something on the set of tweets. Much of that propelled actually because you had some US House of Representatives and senators liking the tweets, including Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, which caused an explosion. I got a lot of
Okay,
debate
well,
underneath my tweets after that. But that has been actually been my strategy from very early on in my career is that I might work for a place, but I need to be able to separate like Dale, the individual, from Dale working for. Um, and so I very much have tried to craft a brand for myself as being seen as a subject matter expert in these disciplines,
yeah, yeah.
but working for these places.
That's very cool. So you're always trying to create your own brand and maintain that and present yourself as a thought leader. That's great. Very proactive. I like it. Uh,
But I think it's been a way for me as well to I use social media as a way to not just build like that visibility of 4-day week conversation, but to add legitimacy to that conversation as well. And I can talk about more than just this conversation. And
yeah.
I can talk about it from multiple points of view, whether it's economists or sociologists or psychologists. I challenge myself to upskill in those disciplines as well in order to, engage in debate about them. Most importantly, though, actually, creating social media content has been one of these amazing ways for me to learn uh, new material because it forces me to write in a way that is accessible to an audience and a general audience. So I need to fully understand what I'm talking about as well in order to translate it into something that's accessible. So I leverage it, yeah, for learning as
Yeah,
well.
it's a great point. Using it as your learning journal, but also showing other people you really know what you're talking about, backing it up with facts and research, like you did today when you're talking about Gallup, right? I was loving that one. So you're talking about the employee engagement results that were released by Gallup every year. I actually wrote an article for the journal about 9 years ago, citing the exact same study. And employee engagement in Ireland was at 16% at that time, and active disengagement was more or less the same. And you've got that big chunk in the middle.
We haven't made huge strides despite all of our efforts over the last few years. And yeah, it speaks to some systemic issues that we have in the workplace, I think.
What do you think those are?
I feel like I'm in a bit of an economist brain at the moment because I'm reading a book
Okay.
called Friday is the New Saturday, How a 4-Day Week Can Save Capitalism. And so I'm challenging myself actually to look at the validity of some of these things from the other side of the political spectrum. And I think a lot of it does come down to these very outdated paradigms of management that have gradually, worked in such a way maybe up to the 70s and 80s. But you also had a lot of welfare companies that well supported their workers. You also had a lot of unions who protected workers. But we've seen this gradual erosion, I think, of managers' expectations over the last 20 years. I don't think hybrid and flexible working has actually made that issue easier. I think it's made it a lot worse. Um, Now, time has become such an important resource because there's been such a blurring of boundary of when people aren't working, but most importantly, when people are working. And managers, I think, have taken advantage of that and nearly lost the run of themselves in many instances.
So hard to have boundaries with remote work.
Yeah, like as in, I think that's why we're seeing things like right to disconnect policies coming in different
Mhm.
countries. The idea of the 9 to 5 is gone, but that doesn't mean that you are available from 7 a.m. till 8 p.m. And that is what we are seeing in so much of the world at the moment, fueled by globalization. So people taking calls with Australia in the morning and then the US in the evening and expected to be available in the middle of the day as well. So I do think we need to, if we are going to, continue down this path, we need to start putting protections around people in order.
But how much is an external versus an internal? External being your manager or boss telling you, versus let's say me not being able to say no and set my own boundaries.
So as behavior scientists, I think there's like I always use the horse to water analogy. So you can lead the horse to water. So policy can enable these sort of structures. They can say that we don't expect you to work beyond, we have flexible working. You can then create the culture. So you can poke the horse, you can get all these other horses drinking the water, and that will encourage you to want to take up these policies effectively. But then you're right, the last element is actually a level of self-determination over this as well, that I need to figure out how to manage my own performance in the context of a flexible working pattern. When those three things align, that's obviously where you get really good benefits. But if any of those are askew, then the benefits aren't realized. Sometimes I think there's disproportionate blame put on people who, as you say, can say no. But actually, what I think happens often is that those people are looking in their environment for cues to tell them that it's actually not okay for you to take this policy in practice. And they're actually quite subtle forms of microaggressions that we see in the world of work, like, why did you log off last night at 5 o'clock? I needed you till 6, or all of those sort of things. So the lack of transparency around how teams self-organize in the context of these flexible working policies means that you have these situations where the benefits aren't necessarily realized.
Right? Or leadership is, expecting people to work longer, or they're working longer, or they're not setting those clear boundaries. From behavioral science perspective, how do we go about solving that? What seems to me like a riddle.
Yeah, well, leaders and modeling amongst leadership is probably one of the most powerful tools that we could do to evoke any sort of behavior change in an organization. So when we talk about organizations changing into 4-day weeks, we highly encourage leaders to be part of that transition, because this should be an organization as a whole change. And much of the issues in our world of work don't necessarily come down to the employees alone. They actually come down to poor management, and management not knowing how to organize work for employees in a way that helps them to improve efficiency. So what Pedro speaks about in his book here is that 5-day week suits the status quo form of management. In fact, it's not really 5-day week in many instances. It's beyond that. There's people working into Saturdays or working beyond their working hours. And that's a failure of management. Management was supposed to be there to put the boundaries around when work starts and how work is organized. If they are not able to achieve that in the 5-day week, then we need to place some emphasis on improving managers' effectiveness. And a 4-day week forces the spotlight on that barrier within our current system.
So is that what you guys do? You kind of come in and you show management how to delegate effectively, plan effectively, think clearly?
Yeah, management, we don't just put it all on management, but we do focus on, okay, well, what can the individual do to improve their levels of performance? Can we block out individual time for people to do important tasks and make sure that they actually can allow themselves to get into focus mode to do those tasks? But for example, management might be the ones running morning stand-up calls, and those morning stand-up calls are an hour long. One thing you might see managers encouraged to do is either get rid of those altogether, or to reduce them to 10 minutes and make them hugely succinct and meaningful. So really with management, it's like, how do you leverage your current technology process and your communication and create a new form of culture that can facilitate time reduction while also maintaining the same level of productivity? And that's a challenge that managers should be willing to stand up and take on.
That's a huge challenge. I was struck by what you wrote on LinkedIn today, saying that loneliness is increasing in the workforce, but equally we're trying to remote work and we're trying to reduce the amount of times to trying days a week we work to 4-day. So I wonder sometimes if meetings are a form of dealing with the loneliness. And so it's two sides of the same coin. We want to reduce our amount of work and we want to be less lonely. So we're having meetings.
It's an interesting perspective. Yeah. And I would say it definitely plays into, the narrative for some people. I'm actually researching loneliness quite a good bit at the moment because I'm doing another startup as well on how do we address the loneliness crisis, particularly amongst young people. And what I think is, first of all, again, you can look at it from the multiple elements of the individual up to the organization. So you look at policies around work, and I think hybrid working is emerging as the most, beneficial of working policies at the moment, a form of hybrid working that works for people and for the business. But that's only when organizations structure work in such a way that the benefits can be realized depending on where people are working. So if they are at home, they're doing that individual work. And when they are in the office or the workspace, that is for communication, it's for collaboration, it's for teamwork activities. You don't see those benefits if they're in the office on MS Team calls the person across the cubicle from them all day.
Yeah, right.
The second element is managers again play a role in mitigating loneliness, but that depends on who's in management. And one of the things is that we know people fail upwards in promotions. So just because people tend to be good at a technical skill, they very often find themselves then in a people management role, which they don't want to be in, but they find themselves in. And I think that can perpetuate then issues of loneliness for non-management people because they're being managed by someone who doesn't have an interest in them, and that's okay as well. The last thing then is loneliness actually as a state is what I've just learned is an ego fueled state. So when you feel lonely, you actually become very self-absorbed, you become self-preserving, and in order to actually mitigate loneliness, you actually need to be forced into situations where you are not, in that comfort state. You need to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And there is a risk, obviously, when in remote work, that could be perpetuated even further, that the comfort economy is just going to grow and grow and grow. But I think a little bit more optimistically in saying by creating more time, it actually enables people to create more communities of local practice. I joined a running club in Nace 5 months ago,
Very good.
and I've made loads of new friends from that. And that has been created because I have the time to go to it, but also because the person who created the group has the time to run it as well. So I think that we need to think a little bit more flexibly about loneliness, not just in work, but outside of work.
Yeah, exactly. I think that makes tons of sense. So it's like a restructuring of the way you get your connection. Because you take time away from the workday, then you get maybe connection more in the way you want to get it through your running club. Or I think maybe there'll be more workspace or co-working spaces in hubs where people will go and they'll connect there. Not necessarily jumping on a meaningless meeting with their team or their manager, but more connecting, having a nice coffee in a way, more on their terms rather than be forced to connect. So maybe comfort and connection at the same time? Or is that too much of a lofty goal?
Well, no, I think we all need comfort to a certain degree, but I think uh, leisure is something that has been kind of criticized so much by particularly the likes of capitalism. If you're not working, if you're not doing, then you're not being productive. But actually, some of the greatest innovation comes from those moments of connection that you have with people in your downtime, whether it's with family, friends, colleagues that you maybe from previous jobs. Ideas spark in those spaces. So, um, I also think that we should think of leisure as a form of lubricant for, making work more smoothly in the future. Not just because people are more rested, but because people are more creative as well.
I love it. I love it. It all sounds so good. But I do have some burning questions like, how does this scale? Does it work for healthcare? Does it work for emergency services? Or is it purely tech and computer based work?
Great question. So the bias within the data at the moment is definitely towards the white collar sector. So they are the ones who are signing up to trials at a quicker pace. They are the ones who are by often, at the forefront of innovation. And they are the ones who can compete, particularly when it comes to things like employee value propositions and all of those sort of things to get the top form of talent. But we have seen a lot of small and medium enterprises and non-traditional sectors actually experimenting with working time reduction as well. And it all depends on the sector, but they're fueled by different actors. So the private sector is doing this from a place of competition with their, with their competition. You have the public sector coming on this from a cost saving or productivity narrative. Then you also have trade unions as well starting to get on board with the 4-day week and making that as part of future collective bargaining negotiations. So we have seen IG Metall, a large union in Germany, most recently, as of last week, a Swedish union which represents healthcare
Wow.
workers, making it as part of their future negotiations as well. But the thing is, the 4 day week will look different depending on what sector you're in because each sector has a different purpose. So if it is to make profit and you are a deliverable based model of work, maybe you can work what we think of as a 4 day week, Monday through to Thursday, and you can close your offices on Friday. But that's not how some sectors organize. Some might have five shorter working days, and actually it's the equivalent of a
Right.
4 day, but actually services are kept open. Some might actually have Monday through to Thursday and some Tuesday to Friday. So if there's a customer facing role, the customer is always receiving the same level of service. And when we take something like healthcare, which is typically an under-resourced and under, or overutilized service, typically owned by the public and facing high levels of staff burnout and recruitment and retention issues at the moment. How would you even dare contemplate something like a 4 day week in that sector? But in fact, it's probably what's desperately needed because this current model of working is creating a very unsustainable level of uh, human resource.
And super burnt out healthcare workers.
For the first time, you have people, healthcare is no longer seen as a desirable career, which it was, even as of 8 or 9 years ago. And pay hasn't increased, relative to the amount of hours that many healthcare workers are doing. They've obviously went through the hardest level of stress during the pandemic. People are no longer entering the professions, but also people are leaving at a rate that is higher than before. They're not going from one system to another, they're leaving the sector altogether. So when you think about it as like a bath, if you have water coming down, i.e. people coming in, but then there's nothing stopping it, of course it's just going to create this flow of, with nothing to be left in the bath. So we need to figure out how do we both attract and retain staff. And something like a 4 day week is one of those key things that we know helps to pull the, put the plug in the bath in the first place. I don't know why I went with the analogy of a bath.
It works. I like it.
Um, and we've seen that happen in Iceland. They actually had to invest more in staff. So they had to hire more staff in order to allow their other staff to work a 4 day week. But surprisingly, they were able to reduce their reliance on agency staff, which were costing the system more anyway. And when they did the numbers up, there was actually a net economic benefit because they created
Oh,
much
wow.
more sustainable.
I love it. So it's more sustainable. It saves money. The staff are happier. They're more alert. I guess they're going to be more focused. So it ticks a tons of boxes. It strikes me as whenever we try to implement a change that puts a cost on the front, it saves us like more than that on the back end. It's the same, if you eat healthy food, it saves you on the expense of getting, all the corrective surgery or whatever it is you need on the other side. But that's a hard pill to swallow. That can be hard to sell. So I'm interested how you talk to organizations, CEOs, managing directors, and you convince them to make that change. And how do you invoke that change in the teams then as well to get them to buy into it? Because they're thinking, I'm already overworked and now you're telling me to work a day less. You're going to give me even more stress.
Great question. And I always, oh my God, I'm going to come up with another analogy. I'm so sorry.
Let's do it.
You think about, like, there's an analogy of this guy is standing by a river and he sees all these bodies floating by, and what he's doing is he's taking out the bodies as they're floating by, and that's what he's doing. What would be what would be much smarter of him and less labor intensive would be to go upstream and find out why the bodies are falling in the first place and to stop that from occurring. And the same analogy can be said with so much of how we operate in the world of work. We're very reactive, and less preventative or proactive in our forms of thinking. And that's because there is an inertia to wanting to make a proactive level of change because it's much harder to measure. Reactive change is much easier to say. When we're operating down here all the time, we can quantify how many medical errors were made, this month versus last month, and this short-term intervention helped to mitigate it by 20% or whatever. But we often aren't very good at tracking that longer term, and oftentimes those shorter level interventions, dip in their effectiveness quite quickly. So when speaking to CFOs and CEOs, we come with that sort of narrative is that this is part of your strategic thinking longer term for the business. And therefore, the transition for your business might actually be medium and long term as well. But it's about a catalyst for change and growth at this point. It fits in broadly with other narratives that businesses are starting to think about when it comes to equity and to well being of their workforce and to building more sustainable practices within their world of work. So we start using those sort of narratives and languages as well to realize this is not something very distinct as much as it's being baked into your current strategies as well. CFOs hate the idea at first, as you can imagine, because all they see is, well, we're going to end up paying our workers 20% more because they're working 20% less. And we quickly make them realize what we're focused on here is outcome based work and not time as the arbitrary metric of productivity. And in doing so, there is a psychological contract being written between the employer and the employee that we will gift this time off in return for the guarantee of the maintenance of levels of productivity. And when you create that form of an equation, you can realize how there's vested interests in everyone wanting to make this successful. Because if nothing changes when it comes to revenue generation or output or whatever it is, then that's good for business, that's good for people. Um, but often that's not enough for CEOs and CFOs, so they want something a little bit more immediate. And those immediate savings that we tell them is you are paying disproportionately high levels on well-being and mental health and absenteeism and sick leave and recruitment and retention, all now relative to the past. And we know that a 4-day week helps to significantly reduce those costs. So do up the numbers, see how much potentially you could save from implementing something like this for some of the overheads, and what's the potential, cash loss within the first 6 months, and then be comfortable with that level of risk that this is an experimentation, a form of human resource innovation in your business, the same way that you would embark on a journey of technological or financial transformation.
I love it. It makes tons of sense. I love that psychological contract because then you can see both parties buying into it. And I guess one of the concerns I would have is they would say, okay, now, thanks, Dr. Dale, you've got us down to a 4-day week. We're at the exact same levels of productivity. Turns out revenue's either even gone up. We've a way to make it go up even further. We're going to go back to 5 days because now we know we can do it in 80% of the time.
Yeah, and look, that is always a risk, but that's not what has bore out for us in the past. When we had the 6-day week, we were told we can never have the 5-day week. And then suddenly Henry Ford implementing it in his own factories made this a proof of concept, and it just became socialized. This is how we are going to be in the future. So when you have those actors like political bodies, like the private sector, like the public sector, all emerging in this conversation, it's very clear that there is a push towards a different type of work that is going to eventually become mandatory in the world of work in the future. But it's also extremely short-sighted of management to think that as well, because you would hope that by the journey that we're bringing them on, it's about realizing work is a highly cognitive and emotional type of place now relative to when the 5-day week was implemented, where it was very physical. And therefore, one of the most critical skills you can learn in order to boost your profits is understanding how do you motivate your workforce and how do you get their brains as such to work as effectively as possible. And all industries that focus on cognition, clearly state rest plus stress equals growth. So if you decide to return to a model of work that is just going to perpetuate higher levels of stress, you are going to lose those gains that you achieved throughout your 4-day week trial.
Makes tons of sense. Makes tons of sense. You've thought this through, right? So can I ask, I meant to say, I loved one of the posts that you had online where you talked about instead of the companies trying to incentivize people by having better wellness programs and giving them perks at work, the 4-day week allows them to choose their own perks and their own free time. And yeah, I've never heard anyone say that before. And I just thought, yeah, of course we all want the autonomy to choose our own free time and our own leisure and fun and who we're going to spend it with. Not say, oh, here's your fun. Starts now, lasts for 2 hours.
I think this is where we've got well-being at work extremely wrong. You can think of well-being as kind of just two approaches. There's the very individual level well-being, and then there's well-being at work, which is more, systemic structures, governance, hierarchy, all how all those things influence on people's level of autonomy. And that's the hard bit to work on, because it means often a level of introspection for leaders to realize that they're probably part of the problem, in how they address their workforce, the assumptions that they make about their workforce, and often how profit is, the be all and end all. The alternative viewpoint to look at is that that's not, the role of well-being at work is not to focus on individuals' health and well-being through things like yoga, through, wellness programs, all of those sort of things. Your role as a leader is to address those issues at work that cause people to feel unwell in the first place. It's on people themselves to figure out how to manage their own well-being, but we must give them the time to be able to consider that in the first place.
Yeah.
And I feel like we just have we have leaders taking on the responsibility of what individuals should be taking on, and no one is looking actually at the problems that businesses are creating in the first place.
So it's almost like a double fix, right? You're super stressed because you're working so much. Here's a mindfulness and yoga session for an hour and then get back to work. Whereas if you're not super stressed in the first place, maybe there's no need for the mindfulness and yoga session.
Totally. And that's what we also make the case for to CFOs. Stop spending money on stuff like this if it's not moving the dial for your well-being. If you're evidence-based practitioners, as many CFOs will consider themselves to be, why would you be investing your revenue in interventions that aren't working? Why not try something that is, yes, more risky, but has been showcased with greater levels of data to work? And we just need to be able to get in and socialize these ideas. But one must experiment in order to understand actually a lot of the fears and misconceptions about the 4-day week are unfounded once you actually get in and just give things a go.
So is that how you deal with the leaders? Because I'd be thinking if you're coming in, and probably on some level, if I'm a leader, I'm going to have to reflect on my own self and my own work and my own management style. And you're coming in, you're saying, we've got a different way. I've got to be pretty, I want to say stoic, or let's say I have to have done the personal work myself to be able to take that sort of feedback, assuming it's, 100% on the money. But probably I've got a lot of personal development to do, professional development to do. So how do you make that an easy pill to swallow for people who need to kind of improve their management game?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like it's not happening. I've worked in several businesses where leadership development is an integral part of any promotion process. And really, this is about setting up an environment where experimentation on the outcomes of those leadership development programs can actually be occurring. I've done quite a few of them myself in previous workplaces, and it's all well and good what's being said in these workplaces, but then you go back into a system that doesn't allow you to actually experiment at all. And then, of course, you're just going to regress and conform to whatever the cultural norm is. What 4-day week trials have been creating is a form of psychological safety in workplaces for experimentation, for vulnerability, actually. One of the key outcomes that we see from companies and the behaviors of companies is that this should be enabled by leadership, but actually should be co-designed with staff. So the best version of a 4-day week will be designed when staff tell you actually how they can make it work in HR, how they can make this work in sales, in frontline responsibilities. It's not all on to managers to have the answers to those questions, because they aren't the ones, at the cold face on the day-to-day basis.
That's great. So facilitating that conversation and allowing the team to come up with the answers.
Yeah, and creating trust within teams. And as we said, this is not an, management versus staff, which often, when we look at other rewards, salary is that natural tension exists because staff will work towards trying to achieve a certain form of remuneration. In this is a gift of time in return for a certain level of productivity. And that is a mutual partnership as such.
Yeah, I love it. It all sounds great. I'm signing up. I'm a self-employed person. One of my friends is a CEO of a company. He was talking to me during the week about when he kicked off, he was working 80, 100 hours a week. I try to limit my days to 4 days a week, but then they always drag into five, sometimes into 5.5. How does it map on those two other paradigms? Self employment and somebody, let's say, trying to start a high growth business.
Yeah, well, I think we must look first at what are the determining factors for high growth businesses, and it's not necessarily always time on task. We know that capitalism is fueled by innovation, and innovation comes best when people are have the brain capacity to actually think laterally and to innovate. So even from that very basic biological level, not having a stressed out CEO is a good CEO for the business. And that's something I practice myself. It's very easy for me in my job, if I wanted to work 7 days a week. The work is there for me to do it if I want to do it. Um, but by forcing myself to actually work a 4 day week, I am forced to also say no to things that aren't a high priority for me. Say, I'm not going to have a meeting with that person because it's easier. I'll actually, which is often things that we do. We delay the inevitable by just saying we'll have a meeting with that person next week, and you're forcing yourself into a restricted time frame in which things must be done, thus challenging yourself to work smarter but not necessarily longer. So in forms of leadership and management, we need to see more of that, because we know uh those professions report the highest levels of burnout in our workforce, which obviously then ripples down to non-management. If you've a burned out manager or CEO, that's going to feed down throughout the entire structure. For self-employed people, then obviously there is less structure as such. You've less people to go through in order to seek that level of approval, and depending on your industry, you might be at the mercy of customers. So I think when talking about a individual working self-employment, it's about trying to work in a way that works for you, but not necessarily working when you know you're not being productive. And when I was doing my PhD, for example, in my final year, I only worked 4 days a week and I only worked 4 hours a day. And that's because the 4 hours I did were very productive. But I knew that come the end of the fourth hour, my brain was starting to, get diminished returns. The marginal productivity, was starting to occur. So in order to stop the breaks and stop myself from creating a ripple of, fatigue and thus burnout, I had to force myself to stop working and to detach. Um, and so that's for an individual self-employed, having that sort of mantra and way of thinking, I think is quite important. Being very sensitive to how you are experiencing levels of fatigue and thus organizing your day as much as you can to work in a way
I
that.
think they're super points. 100% agree with you. Whenever I've tried to restrict my work and say I'm not going to do that extra thing, or get everything into 2 or 3 days, maybe because you have to if there's a wedding or a baptism or something coming up, productivity shoots up. And I feel there's also a little bit of, I don't know if you've ever heard this phrase, like, busyness is a form of laziness, like indiscriminate action, and like a prioritization. So it's like saying to myself, I don't really know what's important, or I haven't taken the time to sit down and think about it and really chart that out. So I'm going to do everything. And now I'm a busy fool.
So, and when I hear people say that they're extremely busy, um, I there's certain cohorts.
You think you're not doing it right, right?
Well, I think there's certain cohorts I really empathize with, because I know there's people who are working two or three jobs. There are people who have kids that they look after workplaces, caring for elderly parents, all those sort of people. And then there are people who actually love being at work, love working long hours, but also love complaining about working long hours and thinking that it's a medal of honor to wear.
Yeah, right. It's one of those, oh, I'm so busy, therefore I'm so important. But we kind of have to separate from that, right?
It kind of gives me the ick a small bit. I feel like it speaks more to a level of inefficiency within your own ability to actually structure your day to find some sense of balance. There is nothing to be glorified in your whole life being your work, and we know that when people place all of their emphasis on work, it just leads to negative effects in every other aspect of their life. there are certain cultures where death by overwork is literally a work.
This is Japan. Kuroshi.
Why are we glorifying that? And work work wasn't always created to be that way either. We have collectively decided as a society to make it that. So if we know that there's an alternative where we can maintain growth or productivity or whatever the outcome of is in capitalism, which is the structure that's here to stay, um, why aren't we endorsing that if it creates a better future for us instead of creating a system now or living in the system now, which is ultimately burning us out, but also burning the world around us as well. The way we're working is totally unsustainable into the future, and we see that with all those trends. We see that with Gallup's State of the Global Workforce, higher levels of loneliness in young people, worsening levels of well-being. Greater levels of precariousness when it comes to housing and job security and social security and all of those sort of things. There is a much broader conversation to have around the world that we're trying to create, and thus the world of work that we need to create as well in that process.
Inspirational, Dale. It is a massive paradigm shift, but it sounds like it's exactly what we need. We need to restructure the way we think about work, make some decisions. And I think what you were saying earlier, it's very industry and organization specific, and they're probably tough conversations to have and very difficult strategies to map out. But that's important work to be done as well, right? Just because it's difficult or taxing doesn't mean it shouldn't be taken on. So I was on your LinkedIn and I was looking, you have like 5 different positions you're currently doing. Where now, not all of them are 100%, right? Your CEO work, I guess, is a huge chunk of it. But still, there's 4 other positions on your LinkedIn profile, and you're talking about another startup. So could I ask you to give us some productivity tips? How do you do 5+1 roles?
So I'm very fortunate that I have huge autonomy, obviously, over my own scheduling of my work. So some of those other jobs are advisory roles that I'm just able to support in. So they don't typically require me to, take full days off or anything like that. Oftentimes they complement and synchronize quite a lot with the work that I do as well. So I often try and harmonize work that I do in order to do that. The reason I'm setting up a startup is because I was personally interested in the concept of loneliness. Moved from Dublin down to the countryside to save money and started to feel quite lonely. And as an academic, the first thing I do is try and figure out what does the research.
Yeah, I love it. So I'm going to read some books on my own.
I'm going to read some books about how to be less lonely. And then I realized, God, there's not much out there actually happening to try and, implement some of these recommendations that academics are saying. So I've been having conversations with friends and reconnecting with people that I disconnected with for a long time. And we have been fruitfully having these conversations on Fridays, every other Friday, and setting up this startup. So it hasn't actually felt like work. It just felt like a huge creative project for me at the moment. I'm sure I'll probably feel quite different when the business element starts to kick in. But that's it. Like the time off enables me to do something that's of interest to me, as well as doing other bits and bobs like, cleaning up the house and doing life admin and all that sort of stuff. Taking up strength training. I started going to a PT as well.
Fantastic.
So there's loads of different beneficial outcomes for me. And I've just figured out how to make it work over the last few years. I suppose I'm quite selfish with my time. I don't just have meetings for the sake of meetings. But I also do allocate time to like mentor and support people where I can, particularly people who, because that's something that I receive a lot of in my time. I've become a fast reader. I use AI to help me
Super.
go through material quite quickly as well in order to get the main points. I'm just constantly in a place of being relatively uncomfortable, but I've become comfortable being that. So that has helped me grow a lot, I think, over the last few years.
Fantastic. So there's some great tips there, from being selfish with your time to using AI and everything in between. I noticed there's a lot of increase in apps like Meetup or WhatsApp group or Telegram groups, lots of different ways for people to connect. But I wonder about the connection which is superficial, like we're all at the cinema together, versus we actually know anything meaningful or substantial about each other. Um, do you think we're lacking one or both?
Yeah, I think the social contract has been rewritten quite aggressively over the last few years. We now think of connection as quantity of people that we know versus quality of interaction that we have with people. And that only became obvious to me when I started coming away from conversations with some people that I hadn't spoken to for a long time and feeling really energized by the conversation, which led to me being curious as to what was actually happening in that conversation that was making me go away and feel that level of oxytocin release that we know happens when people feel connected. And really, it was about making, I've realized that it's about having people at the same level. So, setting up conversations in such a way that people are coming in with the same expectation or the same outcome. When I first joined the running club, I only wanted to go there to have a common interest in running and to talk about that because I had no one else to talk to about that. But when I meet up with some other people, I want deep philosophical conversations, and I know who the people are that I need to go to for that. So trying to find your tribe and find your tribe depending on what your interest is and what type of conversation you want to have, I think has been a hugely valuable, exercise for me over the last while. And in a way, we need to train people how to talk again. And I think particularly younger generations who maybe grew up in a world where there was no in-person interaction for large parts of their life. Everything was on social forms of media. So they've never really had authenticity in interaction. They've never seen, the very core of human experience because everything has always been picture perfect and filtered. And so we want to be able to design experiences where people can remove all of that noise and try and understand, first of all, themselves, which is the first step in any level of connection, is connection with yourself before you can allow yourself to try and connect with others. And technology is here to stay. One of the main things, obviously, we know is social media creates higher levels of loneliness, because one is constantly comparing themselves against others. So we need to figure out how we can make tech for good. How do we actually create online communities where people can have that sense of vulnerability and authenticity without feeling this need to put the ego up and put the best version of themselves?
Yeah. Seeking connection instead of status.
Yeah, totally. But I think we've completed both of them at the moment. They seem like the same thing.
Yeah, yeah, it's really unfortunate. And also I wonder about social media can often be one way. I'm always speaking or I'm always listening, but then when you're at a running club with five other people, oh, which one is it? Well, it's a bit of both, right? And I wonder if those skills are being lost a little bit with more and more technology and remote working.
But it's things like the comfort economy as well. People don't have to leave their houses now if they don't want to. You can get your food delivered, you can have all, your TVs online, you can work from home. And as human beings, we're inherently social creatures. Harvard's study of human development and, an 80-year longitudinal study, the single most predictor of longer term health and longevity is human relationships. And so I like to think of it actually as the last lifestyle pillar that we have yet to understand. We we know a lot about how people can be more physically active, how they can sleep more, how they can eat better, but we don't know how to actually get people to connect with one another anymore. And maybe we never did. Particularly, you look at Ireland, we have a high drinking culture, which obviously created a level of connection in places like pubs. But without that social lubricant, what level of genuine conversation really did exist in Irish society? And we want to be able to, create that future for people. Um, I think I was at a conference a few weeks back, and the Surgeon General from the US, who focused a lot on human connection as his main public health pillar, said that he has useless friends. And I thought it was such a great way of describing it. People who and when I say that term, you kind of know what I'm talking about. They're people who you might have known for a long time or serve no, status advantage to you, but you just love hanging out with them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I love having those useless
Oh,
friends,
yeah.
but many of us don't have them.
Yeah.
They're the best ones.
They're the best crack. Yeah.
Just want to be with them just because they're pure fun. You're not looking for a networking opportunity. You're not looking for a new job. You just want to hang out and have a laugh. Absolutely.
And look,
Um,
in Ireland, we're very social. But like, for example, my friends in New York, that just doesn't exist. Like, friendships don't exist without the purpose of networking.
That's so sad.
So, like, there are whole cultures where they're not even exposed to this way of thinking. So there's such a level of unconsciousness about the topic as well, which I think shows a huge potential.
Do you think it's a scale issue? There's millions of people in New York, whereas in the countryside of Ireland, well, we're going to have a better community just because this is in a community and this is kind of all there's here.
Probably. I mean, like, I think the GA, in many ways, good and bad for Irish community. It created a focal point for many rural areas, but also then became the only focal point for many rural
right.
areas. And if you weren't in it, you were out. Um, I think as Irish people, we're kind of brazen as well. We kind of talk to anyone, and we're always nosy, and we always want to know about people's
Mm.
business, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Um, Whereas I think in New York, in my experience, it's like capitalism on steroids. So
Right.
there is always an ulterior motive
Mm.
to grow your capital. And I think when you grow up around that, it's obviously very hard to switch that off. Um, if all you see around you is people who are interested in status and the next startup that they're going to create, of course you're going to feel pressured to conform to that.
Right, because that's the go-to. Oh, wow. A lot to think of there, Dale. I wonder if people have done the personal development on themselves where they can feel comfortable in their own skin, be able to talk to somebody and feel a little bit of rejection, but not take it too personally, be able to have a conversation where they mostly listen, be actively listening where they're commenting on. I wonder if people had those, if we uniformly had those skills and we didn't need alcohol as a crutch. I wonder would that make things any easier?
Well, I can only speak from my own personal experience. I gave up alcohol 2 years ago, and I use it a huge amount as a crux for stress management, but also in social situations as well. And for the guts of nearly 2 years, I felt socially awkward in situations where everyone else was drinking and I wasn't. And I went to a wedding 2 weeks ago and I danced all night sober, and I never ever would have thought myself possible of doing something like that. But really, I think I have gone through this journey of, as you say, being comfortable being in that state of being uncomfortable. And I can happily now stand in a room full of people talking to other people and no one talking to me, and not allow my ego to come out in full force and think everyone's looking at me. You learn to realize that you're actually just not that important in other people's lives, and that it's all in your head. And I think when you realize that and you believe it viscerally, it's a huge relief.
That's wonderful. Well, it's fair play to you. It's wonderful that you've done all that personal work. I actually think it's paradoxical. I think you both are phenomenally important and not important in other people's lives. And that's okay, because when you're there, it's super important that you're there at the wedding. That's why they've invited you. But equally, if you couldn't go there, it's okay. They'll see you a different day.
Totally. And I also
So,
realized that, yeah, I'm a bad dancer, but so is literally everyone else on this dance floor right now. So,
yeah.
um, so I'm just fitting in, actually, is what
Yeah,
I'm doing.
and that's okay, right?
So they're great realizations. I hope people listening to this can know that through listening to you, that you get comfortable and you build up that kind of muscle almost of being uncomfortable, and then you're just like, you not even think about it then after a while. I've lived abroad in different places, and I felt I had to build up this as well, and then you get really used to it, you get really comfortable. So look, being mindful of your time, that was the whole focus of our conversation today. I'm going to finish this up, but I also want to give you a chance. Is there anything else that you think people should really know about what we've talked about today, 4-day week, or any of the other topics like prioritization or staying connected?
Mm.
Or have we covered it?
I mean, I could talk about the 4-day week till cows come home, but I feel like a more important personal reflection that I've had across my career is when we talk about personal development, like, we really need to be open and honest with yourselves around your own limitations, and not just in the context of work, but in life. And I really like the concept of ego, not in the kind of, you know, macho tech boy way that they talk about ego, but ultimately, if you feel a level of self-consciousness, or you feel yourself getting angry or frustrated at something, it is often ego coming out in you. It's a self-preservation method within yourself. And I think, instead of either feeding into that ego, being curious about it and understanding that actually what you're experiencing probably is a sense of fear, or being afraid of being uncomfortable in whatever situation it is, and lean into that. The more you lean into it, the easier it will become. And as you mentioned earlier on, doing the hard work early on will lead to all these benefits for you longer term. And that's just out of my entire work to date, that's probably been the biggest learning I've had.
I love it. I love it. Lean in to the ego, lean into the vulnerability, lean into feeling uncomfortable in all these situations. It's starting to sound like a Sheryl Sandberg book. So look, to wrap up, I just want to say congrats on everything you've achieved. Phenomenal. From your PhD to the companies you're set up and you're setting up, to getting so many followers on LinkedIn, and to making a real positive difference in the world of work that people in future generations are going to be thanking you for, hopefully, right? When they don't even realize they're doing a 4-day week, and that has been a new thing. So thanks so much. Really appreciate it, and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much, Ronan. Thank you for having me.
Hi, folks. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed this interview, please click the like button. And if you'd like to see more of these soon,